Ukraine has hammered a Russian Black Sea oil loading facility as exports from Moscow plummet by up to 600,000 barrels a day. And Kyiv is considering sending 4 of its mine hunters to help reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Not bad for a country that Donald Trump said had no cards to play. Kyiv again. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. And I'm speaking to you today from Kyiv on my latest reporting visit. We're going to start with what's happening in the close battle. The Institute for the Study of War reports that Ukraine has made modest territorial gains around Kupyansk and Kostyantynivka. It also has undermined Russian claims to have captured some 1,700 square kilometers this year. General Vladimir Gerasimov, the chief of Russia's general staff, was visiting troops in the Southern Command fighting in Ukraine, and he, in a briefing, claimed that they'd captured 1,700 square kilometers and some 80 settlements this year alone. The ISW says it's confirmed that Russia's captured just under 400 square kilometers. That is a quarter of what Gerasimov claimed, and just 13 settlements. So he's exaggerating that at least 6-fold. The fact is, it's undeniable that Russian progress has slowed this year, and the cost, the price that Moscow is paying in terms of lives for each inch of Ukrainian territory it gains, has increased. And that is part of Ukraine's deliberate strategy of attrition. We've heard from the new defense minister. He wants to increase Russian casualties to 50,000 a month. It's ruthless, but that is what Ukraine sees as its route to inflicting pain on Russia to force them to withdraw from this conflict. In the long-range battle, we're going to start with that strike on the Rosneft oil loading facility in Tuapse. Significant dramatic footage of a huge inferno and smoke billowing into the sky. It's particularly significant because we've talked before about the barrage of strikes on the Baltic ports further northwest of St. Petersburg. Ukraine hit Primorsk and Ust-Luga in recent weeks, creating a significant decrease in the export opportunities from there. Russia's been forced to divert oil, rely on other facilities, looking back towards the Black Sea, and just as it looks towards the Black Sea, Ukraine hits it again. There has been a massive increase in Ukraine's long-range strikes over the last couple of years. I was looking at an analysis by a Ukrainian think tank that reported that in January 2024, Ukraine launched about 100 long-range drone strikes against Russia. In March 2026, last month, that figure had increased to 7,000, and the number of targets, the number of areas that they can hit, has increased to a corresponding rate. That's a 70 times increase, and that has forced Russia to choose what it protects with its limited air defense. We've talked before of how Ukraine's size has been one of its greatest strengths in its defense, because just the sheer volume of territory that Russia has to try and capture to conquer this country makes it an enormous challenge, a challenge that Russia just simply doesn't seem up to. Similarly, Russia's size, were Ukraine trying to capture Russia, Russia's size would be a strength. But when it's trying to defend it in this context against long-range airstrikes, it's a weakness, because it's such a vast territory. It gives Ukraine a huge array of targets and various routes that it can take to those targets, stretching Russia's air defenses. Reuters has reported that these combined strikes on Russia's oil exporting facilities has reduced exports since January by around 300,000 barrels per day, and since last year by up to 500,000 barrels per day. Now that is significant, because suggestions were in the Moscow Times that before these strikes on the Baltic, exports were around 4 million barrels per day. So that reduction is approximately around 12% of Russia's export facility. Now, at the same time, prices have increased because of the war in Iran. We've seen the price of a barrel of Urals crude jump by about $10 to $70. So in real terms, that compensates. That's about a 16% increase in the price. So that is being cushioned, but nonetheless, oil accounts for about 25% of the Russian budget revenue, these strikes clearly having a massive effect on the Kremlin's coffers, on its war chest, and that Ukraine's hope is that is going to limit Russia's ability to continue to prosecute the war. Of course, in the long-range battle, it's always a two-way fight, and Russia continues to hammer Ukraine with long-range missiles and drones. It's not quite a week since my last Frontline update, so these figures aren't quite like for like, but over the last 6 days, there have been 1,130 missiles and drones fired at Ukraine. That's starting just the day after that massive 700 missile and drone bombardment that we talked about last week. Just last night, they hit a railway yard in Zaporizhia. At least one worker has died of his wounds. That seems to be part of a new Russian strategy to go after different types of infrastructure, targeting the railways. They've also started targeting water infrastructure. It's curious, that could be a lesson they're copying from the Iranians, who've threatened and targeted water infrastructure in the Gulf, which is clearly absolutely crucial. Desalination plants in the countries in the Gulf, which have very limited water supplies from their desert territories. Here in Ukraine, it seems to be because the winter is over. Russia had been focusing on energy infrastructure to try and break the will of the people. They did spectacular levels of damage, and that is going to be felt next winter as well. Ukraine will be trying to repair as much as it can, but that legacy goes on. Now there appears to be a shift towards railway and water infrastructure. On the Ukrainian Navy mine hunters, a really interesting story by my excellent colleague Larissa Brown at the Times newspaper, that Ukraine is considering deploying its 4 Sandown class mine hunters. Now, these were Royal Navy vessels that the UK gifted to the Ukrainian Navy, and their objective was to help Ukraine clear the mines in the Black Sea after the conflict. But that is clearly not on the horizon, and the Montreux Convention prevents warships passing through the Bosphorus Strait at times of conflict. So neither Russia nor Ukraine can send warships into the Black Sea. There's been talk about possibly trying to get these warships up the Danube, but the fact is they'd be very vulnerable if they are in Ukraine or near Ukraine to Russian attack. Sending them to the Strait of Hormuz would be a really symbolic gesture of Ukraine's growing military prowess, and it comes on the back of their offer, indeed their actions, sending teams, anti-drone teams with interceptor drones and expertise to help the Gulf states create that layered air defense with better, more cost-effective weapons to defend against Iran. Now, sending the Sandowns to the Gulf, highly theoretical at the moment. Of course, it all depends on how and whether Donald Trump can bring his attack on Iran to an end. But nonetheless, Ukraine will be discussing this plan at a meeting with some representatives of some 30 nations at Britain's permanent joint headquarters in Northwood in London today. Finally, on the political front, President Zelensky has said the Druzhba oil pipeline has been repaired and the oil will now start flowing to Hungary. Clearly, that is linked to Viktor Orban's defeat in the election that we talked about last week. Curious report that Estonia is lobbying European nations to ban Russian war veterans from entering the Schengen area. The Schengen area is effectively the free travel zone within the European Union. They estimate that some 1.5 million people have fought in this 4-year war in Ukraine, and that around 640,000 of those are still involved. We've heard estimates that around 300,000 have been killed and there have been over 1 million casualties. That claim of that Estonian policy coming from Radio Free Europe. And finally, I think slightly sideways of the war in Ukraine, but a really interesting report coming out of the Wall Street Journal that President Trump appears to have been kept out of the room by some of his top national security staff when they were discussing key operations in response to Iran. One official saying that his impatience wouldn't be helpful. Thank you as ever. If you've got any questions, please ask them in the comments below. There were loads of really supportive, encouraging comments and really good questions last time. I'm going to try and get through as many as I can. Question number 1, why is the world not doing more? It's a really good question. The world has many, many priorities. This is Europe's priority, and Europe could do more without a doubt. that is something that Ukraine wants. That is something that Ukraine's supporters want. Military resources are stretched in Europe, and this war has exposed how thin things like stockpiles were before the war. What would 30 Swedish Gripen fighters armed with Meteor missiles, what difference would they make? Potentially huge, although Ukraine's Air Force jets have by and large been used in an air defense role, particularly the F-16s. That's what we've seen. They're not being sent deep into Russia because of the risk of losing them to sophisticated Russian air defenses. Nonetheless, we reported last time what appeared to be a change in tactics, the combined strike of a Storm Shadow and glide bombs on the Shahed storage facility at the airport in Donetsk. Potentially a difference. I don't think it would be game-changing. We've used that phrase game-changing quite a lot, and we need to be careful. Why doesn't Ukraine mount air defense on trucks? It's a really good question. They do. They have two types of mobile air defenses that I've seen. They have the sort of old-fashioned type of Gatling guns, the double cannons that were similar things used in World War II, mounted on the back of pickup trucks. And we've also seen them this week unveil footage of their British-supplied Rapid Ranger. That's basically the same system that the British RAF Regiment are using in Iraq at the moment to shoot down Shahed drones. They appear to be using slightly different versions, slightly different missiles. The system that we saw footage of in Ukraine appears to be loaded with Starstreak missiles. The system in Iraq is using Martlet missiles, but fundamentally it's the same idea. A mobile system, sophisticated radar to track incoming missiles, and relatively cheap fire and forget guided missiles to shoot down those drones. Final question, can Ukraine kick Russia out of its territory? That has always been its stated objective. That remains its negotiating position. I think there is a growing realization that that is unlikely. If Ukraine could freeze the front lines now and get security guarantees, meaningful security guarantees from America and from NATO, then perhaps it would accept a frozen conflict. Thank you for watching. If you've got any questions, please ask them in the comments below. And if you'd like to know more about defense and my work, then you can follow me on Twitter at Jerome Starkey. See you next time.